talk about early intervention, what really makes a difference, and I will review some of the research evidence for early intensive behavioral intervention for autism, and finish with some thoughts about the connection between behavioral intervention for autism and applied behavior analysis. Now, as I travel around the world visiting different countries and talking to different groups about what constitutes research evidence for working in this area, one thing that nearly everyone agrees upon is that the earlier you intervene, the better, which is a great start. But not everyone necessarily agrees on what the intervention should be. And in fact, there are still many recommendations for all sorts of interventions that are either unsupported by research evidence or for whom the research evidence does not currently support them. So I'm going to focus on an intervention that is supported by the research evidence. And that is behavioral intervention for autism. And I'm describing this and using this descriptor very carefully because behavioral intervention for autism is one of many different applications of the science of behavior analysis. There remains a common misperception around the world that ABA, applied behavior analysis, is just an intervention for children with autism. And it's not. It's an applied natural science approach to changing human behavior. And there are many, many applications of the science. And its application to working with children with autism is one of them. And I'm going to argue through this presentation that there is more research evidence to support behavioral intervention for autism than there is to support other interventions for children with autism, of which I am sure you know number in the hundreds, if not the thousands, of different interventions. Now, some of the first applications were described as early as the 1960s. Actually, there were some applications described even before this. But this provides a context for, I suppose, telling you that this is not a new phenomenon. We have been working in this area for decades. And indeed, I was involved in a research study in the UK in the 90s. And in the 90s, which is still 25 years ago at the point I did this study, a review of the research evidence at that point, 25 years ago, revealed 550 studies supporting the efficacy of behavioral intervention for autism in terms of building skills for children and ameliorating problem behaviors. I suppose one of the most famous studies in this area, and the study which really suddenly drew people's attention to the science and one of its applications, was the Lovas study published in 1987. The work actually began in the 1970s, but Lovas published his findings in 1987. And what his study showed, and what he described, was that after a number of years and intensive hours of what they called early intensive behavioral intervention, and it was intensive because it was provided on average for 40 hours a week, for 50 weeks of the year for a minimum of 2 years, so very intensive. After that period of time, a large proportion of children made such significant gains that they could now be described as normal functioning. Now, they define that in three very specific ways. The first was that these children now had IQ and adaptive behavior within the normal range, whereas before they did not. The second definition was that these children were now in school, typical mainstream school, and did not require further support. And the third, and possibly most relevant of the ways they defined normal functioning, was that these children, nearly 50%, were otherwise indistinguishable from their typically developing peers. So in other words, if you looked at a video or saw these children interact, and you were asked if you knew which one of the children in the playground had a diagnosis of autism, you would not be able to determine that. So 9 of 19 children, nearly half of these children made these spectacular gains. And in comparison, much smaller numbers, 1 in 39 from a comparison group made anything like such gains. And a follow-up study 6 years later showed that 8 of those 9 children, excuse me, that 8 of those 9 children had maintained all of those characteristics, and the other one child now needed a little bit of additional support in school. Now, these results stunned, I don't think that's too grand a term, the academic world, and not just the academic world, because until that point, I think the general, a widely held belief was that autism was a lifelong neurological condition, and that once you had a diagnosis, that was it. And the Lovaas study and subsequent studies have demonstrated otherwise. Now, of course, we could debate and argue the merits of using words like normal or recovery or cure, and I dislike all of those words. But at the end of the day, you get a diagnosis of autism by virtue of behavioral deficits, 3 specific behavioral deficits, and it follows logically that if you no longer have those deficits, then you no longer meet the criteria for having the diagnosis, and so you lose the diagnosis. Thank you. Coughing is a good prompt. Now, of course, I'm only going to talk about some of the studies. I'm not going to talk about 1,000 studies because I don't have the time. Another study published in 2005 actually attempted to determine whether there was a difference between 2 groups that both had early intensive behavioral intervention, one of which they described as a clinic-directed group, which really meant that the programs were overseen and run by university faculty, or parent-directed groups where the parents would hire staff, but there would be one behavior analyst responsible for overseeing the program. And so I think their hypothesis was that the clinic-directed group would do better, but actually they found no difference between the 2 groups. And they published the data after 4 years. And here are the individual data for these children. And very similar to the Lovaas data, half the children, and I think it's fairly self-evident from the graph, make fairly spectacular progress, whereas the other half do not. Now, for me, a much more interesting research question, given these data and given Lovaas's data, is not is early intensive behavioral intervention effective, but why is it not spectacularly effective for more children than it appears to be, certainly from these early studies? And there could be a whole range of variables involved in answering that question, and it's probably a complicated mix of many of those variables, and those could include things like the age at which you start, the earlier probably the better, some language ability at the start, some being better than none, the involvement of parents, right? The more involved they are, the better, and so on. There are so many variables implicated in why these interventions are effective. Now, in 2009, a Norwegian colleague of mine, Sigmund Eldevik, and colleagues published a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is a scientific method where you look at multiple studies combined to increase the number of subjects involved and increase your predictive abilities by just having a larger sample. And their meta-analysis was restricted to studies that had been peer-reviewed, that reported the effects of early intensive behavioral intervention, where a group having early intensive behavioral intervention was compared with either a control or a comparison group. And the children had to be aged 2 to 7 at intake for these studies, and the effects had to be reported using some kind of psychometric test, either measuring IQ or adaptive behavior, or perhaps both. And at that point in time, they found 9 studies that met those criteria. Now, they used a statistic called the Reliable Change Index, which is a statistic that you can use to calculate the number of individuals who meet criteria for very significant change, and to be able to predict that with a high degree of certainty. And without boring you with the calculations for that statistic, they calculated the Reliable Change Index for IQ to be 27.4 IQ points, and for adaptive behavior to be 20.9 IQ points. So what that means is they were interested in finding out how many children, or what proportion of children, were able to achieve a change of 27.4 IQ points or higher, which is a significant number, nearly 2 standard deviations worth. Now, I think they were surprised when they ran these calculations. Their expectation was that some children would meet those criteria, but perhaps not many. And they actually found that more than 25% of children made spectacular gains from these studies. And here are the data, the proportion of children, the percentage of children that met criteria for Reliable Change Index for IQ and adaptive behavior for behavioral intervention for autism. So the data on the left, and then the control group in the middle, and the comparison group on the right-hand side. Now, that's a fairly spectacular number. So more than 25% of children made spectacular gains. Now, I was at a presentation with Sigmund Eldevik soon after this study came out, and someone in the audience said, or asked, well, that's very interesting, but what proportion of children generally make progress? And his answer was, yeah, most of them. But this number makes spectacular progress. Okay, also in 2009, a large-scale project was conducted across the globe. The National Standards Project aimed to provide a resource to, particularly for parents, in answer to the question, what do I do with my newly diagnosed child? You know, what interventions are available to me, and what's the research evidence for their effectiveness? So the National Standards Project aimed to review all published interventions and produce a set of guidelines and recommendations based on the data. And they reviewed studies in the peer-reviewed treatment literature targeting any individual with autism from the age of 0 to 21. The research had to address at least one core feature of autism, and they identified 775 studies and 38 separate treatments. Now, there were many more studies and there were many more treatments, but they didn't include the studies in this review because they didn't meet certain scientific criteria for inclusion. They then applied 2 metrics to evaluate each study: the scientific merit rating scale, in other words, how good a scientific study was this, and a treatment effects rating. So was the reported intervention beneficial, ineffective, adverse, or actually unknown? And the combination of both of those produced what they called a strength of evidence classification system. And using that, they could confidently ascribe one of these descriptors to those 38 separate treatments. And their interest was, of course, determining whether any of those 38 separate treatments were in the top category, whether they were established. And their definition for that was that there was sufficient evidence available to confidently determine that the treatment they had reviewed was effective. Now, let me cut to the chase. These were the established treatments of the 38. So there are 14 described here. And all but 1 or 2, just by virtue of the name, but also looking at the study in more detail and looking at the treatment in more detail, are clearly some kind of behavioral intervention. So in other words, the majority of established treatments fell into the category of behavioral intervention for autism, although some of them have some quite odd names, I think. In 2014, Jane Howard and colleagues published a follow-up study. They had been working with groups of children, 3 different groups, one group having received intensive behavior analytic treatment, another group having received intensive eclectic treatment, eclectic being a mix of different types of interventions, and a third group having received non-intensive eclectic treatment. Now, they did actually publish a first study after 14 months of treatment, but this study was a follow-up to that, and they published the data after 3 years. And what they found in this study was that the children in the behavior analytic treatment group all made spectacular gains relative to the other 2 groups. And that even if progress wasn't fantastic in year 1, the children in the behavior analytic treatment group went on to make further progress. And for children in the other 2 groups, they progressively lost skills over time. Here is an example of some of the data from that study. In the box in the top left, that is the intensive eclectic treatment group. The first set of data on the left are the intake data, and then you see year 1, year 2, year 3 data. The box in the top right is the non-intensive eclectic group. The box in the bottom left is the intensive behavior analytic treatment group. And what you can see fairly clearly from these data is that the children are progressing much more in that group, and there are more scores in the top half of the box than there are below. And in the last box in the bottom right, you see the difference generally between the intensive behavior analytic treatment group and the other 2 groups. So very clear differences between them. Now, based on these studies and more, and there have been many, as I've said, behavioral intervention for autism now has very specific and unequivocal recommendations from a number of prestigious organizations, and here are some of them. Now, these are not recommendations that one makes lightly. And indeed, based on these recommendations and these studies, in the US now, 100% of US states now reimburse behavioral intervention through medical health insurance. Now that's a pretty spectacular statistic in its own right, because we're talking about insurance companies reimbursing behavioral intervention. right? Insurance companies. Insurance companies don't like reimbursing anything, right? But they are so persuaded by the data that you may now be reimbursed through insurance companies in the US. The last of the groups on this list, Autism Speaks, is an organization that exists globally. And I was at a research presentation several years ago, and their chief scientific officer was talking about how they were spending some of the research money that they got. And her focus was on telling people how they were using the money to look at the etiology of autism. And someone in the audience at the end said, "Why are you not spending the money on looking at interventions for autism?" And she said, "Because the evidence is overwhelmingly in favor of behavioral interventions for autism. We don't feel we need to spend the money on looking more at that." Which I thought was a rather wonderful thing to say. Now, what is contemporary behavioral intervention for autism? It's actually many research-validated methods combined into what ought to be a comprehensive but highly individualized program for a child to teach them both skills that they need, address the skill deficits they have, and address problem behaviors. Now, it's as general as that in the sense that these programs can be, and probably should be, very different because they will be tailored and customized to the needs of each child that you work with. They're designed optimally to help each learner develop the skills they need in order to achieve a level of independence. This is not about removing the diagnosis. This is not about cure or recovery. This is about teaching an individual to live as independently as they are able to live. The skills that are taught and the problem behaviors that may need to be reduced are determined through initial detailed assessment. The skills that we teach and the teaching components that we use to teach them are clearly defined in observable terms. And the skills that we teach and the problem behaviors that we work with are directly and frequently measured. That's an important hallmark of the science of applied behavior analysis. If I go to visit a school or a center and someone has said to me, "We are a quotes unquote ABA school or ABA center," I usually have two questions for them. The first question is, introduce me to the behavior analyst responsible. And the second question is, because I'm a geek, show me the data. And if they're unable to do even one of those things, then that's not a school or a center using the principles of applied behavior analysis. Now, how is this connected to applied behavior analysis? Well, as I said at the beginning, behavioral intervention for autism is one of many interventions for children with autism. But behavioral intervention for autism specifically is an intervention or treatment, or for me, a better descriptor is an educational provision that is based on and uses the principles of applied behavior analysis. Here are some of many, many, many applications of applied behavior analysis. And there are some important and pressing issues on this list that behavior analysts are turning their attention to. But it just gives you an idea of how diverse the applications of the science actually are. Is that 5 minutes or is that off? Okay. That's very subtle. Thank you. How would one know whether you are actually looking at something that could be described as behavioral intervention for autism? And it actually may be very difficult to tell. It might just look like a teacher teaching a child, and in fact it probably will. But ultimately, the definition and quality of what is being provided is entirely determined by the skills and competencies of those responsible for providing it. And skills and competencies are not developed by attending a conference or going on a weekend course. These skills and competencies are developed through advanced academic training and extensive hands-on experience, supervised hands-on experience of teaching individuals using the principles and methods of the science of behavior analysis. So, to summarize, behavioral interventions for autism have overwhelming empirical and international support. And I hope in this brief presentation I have given you a flavor of some of the research supporting this, and by virtue of that list of recommendations, some flavor of the sheer volume of international support for behavioral intervention for autism. Behavioral intervention for autism is one of many applications of the science of applied behavior analysis, and all applied behavior analysis services, provision, whatever you wish to call it, including behavioral intervention for autism, should only be delivered by those properly trained in the science. Thank you very much.